Hey everyone, I'm Ben Norton, and this is the Empire and Deep State series that I at Multipolarista am co-hosting with the American Exception podcast, hosted by friends of the show Aaron Good and Seamus McGinnis. And as always, we are talking today about the book American Exception: Empire and the Deep State by the historian and political scientist Aaron Good, the co-host of this program. And we are now in part 12. We've gone through many different theories and analysis of imperialism, of the deep state, of different, political science analysis of where power lies, what the state is. We've talked about a lot of that. And today we're basically beginning a kind of new part in the series, which is the history focus section. I'm personally very excited about this. This is where I really, I'm most interested in these topics. I really cut my teeth on this stuff. So, we're going to begin at the beginning, as they say, and we're going to start here with a history of the U.S. national security state and the deep state that was constructed after World War II. And this is based on chapter 6 in Aaron's book. And for the most part, from now on, a lot of these episodes are going to be built around history. We're going to talk about theory and stuff, but largely around history. And Aaron, this chapter is one of my favorite chapters in the book. It's a brilliant chapter, and it has a great name. It's An Imperial Colossus is Born. An Imperial Colossus is Born. You're talking about the creation of the U.S. empire and the national security state after the end, or not even before the end, toward the end of World War II. And you talk about the different institutions that are involved, but specifically you talk about the key role of the Council on Foreign Relations, acting as an arm of Wall Street, of big corporations, big capitalists, and their plans to create what they called an American century. That's important because when we talk about the neoconservatives today and their project for the new American century, they're, of course, acknowledging the original American century. But this history is not very well known, even though this history has probably, these historical events that we're talking about in the 1940s are probably some of the most influential historical events in the past 100 years that fundamentally shifted global politics and economics and created the world we live in today. So let's just start by talking about how the post-World War II U.S. empire emerged. And I'll just open this kind of generally with this ridiculous quote, this famous quote from a British court historian, John Robert Seeley. He famously claimed that the British acquired their empire in a fit of absence of mind, claiming that it was just a mistake. It was an accident that the British created their empire. And that's exactly how the U.S. treats its empire. Oh, the U.S. didn't actually it didn't have a plan to create an empire. It's all just an accident that this happened the way it did. But of course, you spell out that it's not in any way an accident. So help us explain how the post-war American empire was created.
I think it's important to understand that the U.S. has always been an oligarchy of sorts. There were democratic elements of the U.S. political system and U.S. society, but there has been, there's also top-down power in American history. And there's a great quote. So FDR said to Colonel House in 1933 in a letter. Colonel House was the famous advisor to Woodrow Wilson and a guy who'd been around the higher circles of U.S. power in the early part of the 20th century. FDR writes to him, "The real truth is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson." So that's coming from FDR himself, who is the president of the United States, and a guy who is connected to the elites. His family has money made from opium trade, the Delano family, the China trade, as it was called. So he would know. And he's pointing out that this country has been owned and run by wealthy people since the days of Andrew Jackson, which is an interesting statement. May have to do with the fact that the end of the Second Bank of the United States leads to, in effect, the power of Wall Street becoming the main financial center of the United States without really any competition. Philadelphia was where the Second Bank of the United States was located, and it was a more nationalized bank, still with some private ownership and kind of a weird structure when you think about it. But still, when the bank ends, Andrew Jackson, can present himself as a guy who's like the anti-banker type person, but it really helped to further empower financial elements that had no connection to the government at all. So private finance really benefited from the end of Andrew Jackson. And so FDR can allude to the fact that an oligarchy emerged around the time of Andrew Jackson, and he was accurate. So in the case of the U.S. after World War II, oligarchy really takes the wheel in terms of steering U.S. grand strategy. They establish this War and Peace Studies project, which we've talked about, mentioned a few times before now. But this is right after the Soviets invade the Germans invade Poland in 1939. Very shortly, this whole thing begins. So the U.S. hasn't even entered the war, and it's not really certain that they're going to. They're not making statements to that effect. But these guys already get to work, and they more or less establish it's the War and Peace Studies Project under the State Department auspices, but it's really undertaken by some amount of State Department personnel, but mostly the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's all paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation. And so this is Standard Oil money, and the Council on Foreign Relations is a Rockefeller organization as well. Very Eastern establishment, kind of Anglophile, connected to the Round Table groups of like Milner and Cecil Rhodes in England, copied on that model. It's a really British imperialist kind of mindset, which makes sense because these guys are like, they have a transnational commercial imperialist, mindset themselves. It's the upper echelons of U.S. capitalism. And you see here on the, these images are taken from the actual report themselves. Vice president at the time was Allen Dulles. Okay. And that's probably the real face of the American empire in its early days and the way it was constructed. And he's a person who worked for the U.S. government, the OSS, during the World War I or during World War II. And he was a part of a diplomatic delegation to Versailles in World War I. So he goes way back in the establishment, has relatives who were two relatives who were Secretary of State. His brother goes on to become Secretary of State. So this is this connection between the government and financial elites. And somebody like Dulles is more or less a leg man for these people. And he wrote 2 sections of this report, which are still classified, on security and sovereignty. And people speculate that this was where he calls for the creation of something like a CIA to be able to manage these affairs internationally. So this was not.
And Aaron, we should point out also that Allen Dulles was, of course, a Wall Street lawyer who then was brought into the Council on Foreign Relations and then eventually creates the CIA. So his background as a Wall Street lawyer is very important.
Right. The overlap between like what you could call oil intelligence when he was working for Sullivan and Cromwell, but also like working on oil deals and still had a State Department appointment. I mean, this goes back a long time. You used to have a lot of Standard Oil employees in the State Department in general in the late in the Gilded Age in the early 1900s. So this is kind of par for the course. Sullivan and Cromwell, Wall Street law firm, represents the biggest corporate clients in the world. The Dulles brothers are a part of that. And so the main takeaway here is that this whole decision of the U.S. to take on the mantle of global leadership was formulated while World War II was going on in an undemocratic way by very wealthy organizations backed by very wealthy people. And they plan out much of the structure of the post-war world order. They argue for things like the IMF, what becomes the IMF, what becomes the World Bank later, what becomes the United Nations, probably what becomes the CIA, although those reports are still classified. And so these are major pillars of the way the U.S. is going to run the world. And they decided they would go for this. So it definitely was not something done in a fit of absence of mind. It was done very deliberatively, in secret. Some of it's still secret today, planned to assert global dominance. So in a way, you could say it's kind of a conspiratorial way to do all this, since it really wasn't debated openly in all that it entailed for the U.S. So no, not a fit of absence of mind, very much planned by oligarchic elements.
Right. And we're talking about the construction of the empire. There are these sort of preceding ideas around things like the Monroe Doctrine and sort of this sense that we have a right to interfere and to control our hemisphere. And that very quickly expands to the world as soon as we sort of assert ourselves as a world power. And on the flip side, I think we're talking about history now. Let's call it mainstream, or if you took U.S. history in high school, that version of the story kind of separates out the sort of George Kennan long telegram story from the cultural one, which is that, okay, we had McCarthyism. Oh, there was this anti-communist hysteria, but we kind of keep those siloed off from each other. And I think what we're getting at here is there's a reason why that's maybe obscured. But how does this thinking in the sort of upper echelons, things like the War and Peace Studies Project, get from the public state, or not the public state, but from the sort of early birth of the deep state to the general American culture that controls our political system and what we talk about and our media, and sort of that influence on the greater American experience that this budding empire had?
Well, I think that the main push to present this to the American public, you can see in this quote from Henry Luce and his famous American Century essay. I mean, he writes this whole essay is basically pitching American leadership on the world and how America is going to be this benevolent leader of global free enterprise system and so on. So it doesn't pitch itself it says the American century, but it studiously avoids calling itself like empire or imperialist. And then,
and Aaron, explain who Henry Luce is really quickly for people who don't know.
Yeah, Henry Luce is a guy who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was the main sort of official publisher with the seal of approval of the overworld of American capitalism, more or less. So he published Time Magazine, Life Magazine, and Fortune Magazine, and he had a very pro-capitalist, pro-American perspective, and he was able to run this media empire in such a way as to promote the values and interests and perceptions and public relations aims of the American oligarchy. So, and a lot of it is kind of pablum for PR purposes, but he slips up in one point here in this essay, and I think kind of gives away some more serious aspects of what he's talking about. He writes, "Our thinking of world trade today is on ridiculously small terms. For example, if we think of Asia as being worth only a few hundred millions a year to us. Actually, in the decades to come, Asia will be worth to us exactly zero, or else it will be worth to us 4, 5, 10 billions of dollars a year. And the latter are the terms we must think in, or else confess a pitiful impotence." And of course, in 1941, this is written in February of 1941. Pearl Harbor hasn't happened yet, but there's an empire. There are empires in East Asia, and Japan is taking them over, and they're Western empires. So they've already taken over French Indochina by this point, and this war machine has its eyes set on the rest of the European empires over there, and those are very valuable, very lucrative, especially Indonesia. People connected to the Council on Foreign Relations knew that Indonesia, West Papua, which is the Dutch East Indies, had a ridiculous amount of gold, for example. And if the Japanese had been allowed to maintain control over that area of the world, they would have become a very rich empire. And a lot of corporate interests in the U.S. would not have been able to make ridiculous amounts of money in the decades after World War II like they have up to the present day. Even the Freeport mine in West Papua is the richest gold mine in the world still today. And we probably don't even know the half of it. They probably obscure how much they actually get out of it. And so this is really what was at stake. It was who was going to own the valuable resources of the world. And this gets packaged as, spreading freedom and democracy in the American way and the free enterprise system, which is quite a euphemism for capitalism. And that's Henry Luce, and that's how it was presented to the American public.
Yeah, and of course, this is very reminiscent of the language that we would see in the 1950s after the victory of the Chinese Revolution in October 1st, 1949, when Mao famously says, China has stood up, has risen up, overthrown its colonial shackles. And then we saw all of this media noise in the US with the press saying, who lost China? How did we lose China? And clearly, if you lose something, you have to own it before you lose it, right? So the narrative that he's getting at there is that if we don't act and create this global spanning empire, we're going to lose Asia. we're going to lose billions and billions of dollars, which I'm sure if you adjusted it for inflation, it would be, hundreds of billions or trillions today. So, I mean, it's really important to keep in mind that this idea of the U.S. losing China and losing Asia is it's simply colonialism. That's exactly how colonialists think. But what's interesting about this, Aaron, is when in your book, when you talk about the role of these Wall Street lawyers and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, this is all Wall Street money working with the State Department to create this plan for a global U.S. empire. And yet this plan is being created at the same time that the U.S. government does have what is probably the most progressive government in its history under FDR. And there are people in the administration who actually are against this plan, especially you talk a lot about the vice president, Henry Wallace, who is the second most popular politician in the U.S. after FDR. And yet he's been completely erased from history, which is an incredible act of, historical erasure. How was this contradiction kind of reconciled, or was it reconciled? How do you have these U.S. corporate elites from Wall Street creating this plan in the State Department for a massive U.S. empire at the same time that you have in the White House progressives who don't want a Cold War and who don't want to create an empire like that?
Well, this, I think, is a case that illustrates the real limits of liberal democracy. It really shows that you cannot have the fundamental basis of a democratic society is that it's the public that controls the state and that it operates in the public interest, in the interest of the majority. But you see with this case that even when the U.S. is at its most democratic, there's nothing to stop the oligarchic forces from asserting control of the state and determining the course of history. And at the time that this was happening, because there were progressive elements in the state and because unregulated capitalism had been discredited, they sought to depict this, to couch this in progressive rhetoric that's much more progressive than what the U.S. says today. I mean, famously during World War II, you had FDR talking about the four freedoms, and these were advertised in and posted and promoted in the U.S. as in images by Norman Rockwell. So you can see Norman Rockwell painting here, talking about the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And this was something that people were to fight for, and this was something that the U.S. was saying should apply to the whole world. And freedom from want is quite notable here. This is something that, if you think like progress sort of moves on in a kind of incremental way and so on, you think, well, this freedom from want, this providing material security for people, why is that still out of reach? Why do we still have tens of thousands of people dying every day from preventable diseases and malnutrition that could be eradicated for a fraction of the cost of the Pentagon budget? And you see the conclusion is that this sort of thinking was rolled back and was destroyed in America. And it was useful to mobilize people to support this war effort because it was a good cause, and you couldn't really say make the world safe for democracy after Woodrow Wilson. So there was more that was promised, and I think that Roosevelt was not insincere insofar as he was behind, supported these ideas. Ditto, and even more so for Henry Wallace, his vice president from 1940, after the 1940 election. But even at this time, you had right-wing elements who were, not excited about this, but they didn't want to be contradicting the president and so on. But they put a whole campaign out about the fifth freedom, okay, which is the fifth freedom is the U.S. free enterprise system. So, capitalism does not really fit with these four freedoms, but these guys just, because they have enough money, they can create a PR campaign to just crudely put that out there. Okay. So even at this point,
freedom to exploit.
Exactly. I mean, that's, capitalism is based on that, on exploitation. It's basically that the market and exploitative market mechanism should prevail through as much of society as possible. And where it doesn't prevail, they kind of want to go after those things: public education, public roads. They'd like to make everything a toll booth, et cetera, et cetera. Because that's just that's the mindset of these people. So this was a contradiction of the time, and it really shows how weak U.S. democracy was even at its strongest point. And there was an anti-fascist. There were a lot of anti-fascist sentiments in the United States as well, and they were fighting against fascism in World War II. So it was good to have an anti-fascist as vice president. But here's Henry Wallace talking about American fascists. If we define an American fascist as one who, in case of conflict, puts money and power ahead of human beings, then there are undoubtedly several million fascists in the United States. Okay, now that defines so many people in the United States and in the United States power structure. And so Wallace is basically pointing out that these people should probably be considered fascists then and now. And he was very popular. Wallace was very popular, second most popular politician, as you say, in the United States. And he only was able to be the vice president in 1940 because FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt intervened to say that basically FDR would drop himself from the ticket if Wallace wasn't the vice president. They basically, it's a dramatic sort of showdown, and then so they let Wallace become president, or vice president. But in 1944, you have what's called Pauley's coup, where Claude Pepper, Florida senator, was going to nominate Henry Wallace for the vice presidential position at the Democratic Convention, and he gets within 5 feet of the microphone, and then people are alarmed because they know what he's going to do, and so they fake a fire. They say there's a fire, and they got to evacuate the building. And so, because if he'd been able to nominate him that night, he would have won hands down. And so there was a conspiracy by this guy named Pauley, who was the Democratic Party treasurer and a California oil millionaire. And they basically scuttled Henry Wallace's vice presidential chances and get him dropped from the ticket, despite the fact that he's extremely popular. And they replace him with Harry Truman. Why do they replace him with Harry Truman? Not that he had distinguished himself in any way, but he hadn't offended anyone. And he said certain things that kind of give you a hint as to his mentality. For example, he said, as a senator, if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany. And that way, let them kill as many as possible. So that logic is kind of, fitting in terms of describing what the U.S. did in the early years of World War II. Even after Pearl Harbor, they wait to go into Europe until basically the Russians have turned the tide and are marching towards Berlin. And so this reflects what the kind of thinking of Harry Truman. It also reflects the Cold War mentality as well. I mean, it just shows that they're more concerned about dominance and global dominance than really having peace, especially in Germany or Russia. That they'd rather pit them against each other, which they do in the Cold War. So this was a tragedy. Wallace was really progressive, and his plans were more for the century of the common man. He put out a counterpoint to Henry Luce in a speech called The Century of the Common Man. And he talks about how this shouldn't be an American century. It should be a century of the common man, where technology in the West is dispersed throughout the world to allow people to develop their societies and solve material, technological problems, and more or less create a just world that kind of conforms to the idea behind the four freedoms. And that would be the way that America could have a leadership position, but a benevolent one instead of an exploitative one. But of course, that wasn't to be.
So on the subject of that Truman quote, I think we see throughout World War II, and I don't want to discount the sort of, I think the American populace itself. Obviously, there is a fascist element in America prior to the war. And then a lot of people genuinely, who at least were aware of what was happening in Germany, were joining for the right reasons. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we have to step outside of the sort of Manichaean duality of World War II, of the U.S. is on the side of good and it's against evil, because ostensibly that's what's happening. But of course, the people who are founding this sort of new plan coming out of it see it very differently. And the real goal is not really to take a side as much as it is to subordinate everybody involved. And so the way that happens in Germany is obviously a lot more of the conventional warfare way, firebombing the industry, except GM factories. You leave those alone, even though they were producing military equipment. And then on the flip side, you have things like Lend-Lease that are subordinating the British Empire by essentially taking away all of their imperial preference trade empire. And that was sort of the new developing way of having a capitalist empire, was to have that sort of unequal exchange set up. And we understood that. And so Lend-Lease was given on the terms that that would be taken away. And because we understood that quote unquote free markets really meant that it was our time to take over. And so by the time we get to 1947, somebody like Secretary of State Dean Acheson says there's really only two great powers left. And what he's referring to is the US and the USSR. So by the end of the war, you see all of the European powers that are supposedly our allies are not our equals. And so as the war leads on, as we're saying, this sort of the birth of a new American century comes about. So at what moment would you say that the US deep state, or what you call the imperial colossus, is born?
So it's tricky to put an exact birth date on like a birth certificate of the United States deep state, but Mike Lofgren, who wrote a decent book on the deep state, kind of a limited hangout in some ways because he underplays the criminality of it all, but Lofgren wrote that the attainment of the nuclear weapon was almost certainly the deep state's moment of conception. Well, I would dispute that and say it's probably more accurate to describe the atomic bombings as the deep state's birth, well after it was conceived by the War and Peace Studies Project. So they get this idea, comes together, and the War and Peace Studies Project is conceived there, and then it violently bursts onto the world scene with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So these nuclear bombs were totally gratuitous. I think Peter Kuznick has done perhaps the most exhaustive work on this. That's accessible, very accessible as well in Untold History of the United States documentary and the book series. The nukes were totally gratuitous, and people like 6 or 7 of those 5-star generals, if I remember correctly, 6 or 7 of them thought they were either unnecessary, immoral, or both. Eisenhower and even Curtis LeMay thought that they didn't need to be done. Japan surrendered when they surrendered because of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. So those things happened. The Soviets rushed to be able to enter the war as they had promised they would do at like Yalta and Potsdam, and they the last remaining bit of an extraterritorial empire that the Japanese had was in Manchuria, and the Soviets came in same time that the bombs were, right after the bombing of Hiroshima, and before the bombing of Nagasaki, but it's like a day later, right? They sweep into Manchuria and they wipe everything out there. They wipe out the Japanese. The Japanese people lose more in the invasion of Manchuria than they lost in the atomic bombings, okay, which killed a couple 100,000 people. But the losses in Manchuria were even more devastating. They were a totally defeated empire. The U.S. knew that the Soviet invasion was coming. They did not need to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. They could have waited to see what the invasion would have done, but they wanted to use the bomb, apparently, to teach the Soviet Union a lesson. The co-director of the Manhattan Project, General Leslie Groves, said himself that there was never any doubt in his mind that the real target of the bomb was the Soviet Union from when the project started and on. When there was a cabinet meeting of the Japanese after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the main subject they talked about as they were discussing the option of surrender was the USSR invasion. They didn't really talk about the losses of Hiroshima and Nagasaki much at all. The atomic bomb explanation kind of becomes a convenient myth for both sides. For the Japanese, they have to ask why they didn't surrender earlier and why they surrendered to the Americans and how they could become so close to the Americans if the Americans gratuitously bombed them that way. In reality, surrendering to the Americans instead of the Russians meant that they would keep their oligarchy in place, their ruling class in place. And so this gratuitous bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is really, and the message it sends to the Soviets, which it kind of terrifies them and induces a lot of panic in the Soviet Union at this time, This I think should be seen as the birth of the American deep state. This kind of top-down power that's going to assert itself in violent ways to direct the course of history and to sort of override any sort of democratic decision making. And for the U.S. at this point, they're the only undamaged great power. They have a monopoly on the nuclear weapons. They have over half of the world's industrial production. They have the largest gold reserves by far, just on paper, and that's just a fraction of it because they recover enormous amounts of Axis gold, both in Europe and in East Asia. And a lot of these go to fund covert operations and things like the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, the sort of ruling one party of Japan that's existed to the present day. We don't even really know about these angles, but so this is another example of just deep political power taking over, and America becoming essentially an empire as per the designs of its oligarchic class, the overworld of corporate wealth.
So, Aaron, part of the narrative that was used to justify the first Cold War was the idea that the Soviet Union was hell-bent on world domination. They were trying to overthrow all independent governments. Of course, we know now that's pretty ridiculous. And I should say that a book that we've talked about in this series is The Doomsday Machine by Daniel Ellsberg. And that book is, I think, very important because it shows that when he was working at the Rand Corporation, which is basically an arm of the Pentagon, they all knew that the Soviet Union, at least from a military perspective, was not in any way threatening the West or really the world, that U.S. military might was always significantly more advanced. The U.S. military technology, missiles, nuclear weapons were all significantly more advanced. So talk about this narrative that was used to justify the first Cold War and the creation of this empire by trying to inflate the threat supposedly posed by the Soviet Union.
You know, as you allude to, the Soviet Union had been fighting a brutal war. Really, the Soviet losses in World War II exceed anything ever experienced in the history of human civilization. They lost 26.6 million people to the United States 400,000. Okay, which means that gets rounded up to 27 million. So it gets rounded up 400,000. So basically the US losses in comparison to the Soviet losses are a rounding error. Okay, it's astounding what the Soviet Union suffered during that war. Stalin had begged the US to enter the war earlier. Churchill really lobbied against that, wanted them more to protect the British Empire in Northern Africa especially. And so they really leave the Soviets to do the bulk of the fighting. And the USSR, it gets described after the fact that the Soviets are really treacherous and that they went back on their word. But this really wasn't the case. It came out that eventually that by and large, Stalin had adhered to the things that they had agreed at Yalta and at other conferences. And there's even a surviving document that you can see, you can find online. It's called the percentages documents. I have found a picture of it. So you can actually see in this sort of famous or infamous document, which Churchill called the naughty document. And it was sort of put down on a scrap of paper that was nearby, also known as the percentages agreement. But it's Stalin and Churchill at the Fourth Moscow Conference in October of 1944, dividing up Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So you see Yugoslavia as like a 50-50 split for influence, and you have Bulgaria, Greece on here. The British and the Americans would end up controlling Greece. That seemed to be part of the deal. And Stalin really sticks to this. In fact, it causes a rift between the Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, a kind of a split in the communist world over this, because Tito wants to support the Greeks who are fighting against the monarchists and so on, and they're leftists. And Stalin says, "Are you crazy? The Americans will never accept losing Greece. It's like a key to their plans in the Mediterranean. They're never going to tolerate this." So Stalin stuck to the plan. Tito was more idealistic about it, but Stalin adhered mostly to these agreements. So it was really the U.S. side that was more duplicitous about this. And even sort of liberal normie historians like Eric Alterman have written about this. This shouldn't be especially controversial to say that the Soviets essentially adhered to these agreements, but the U.S., for Cold War purposes, mischaracterized Soviet actions to say that they were not honoring agreements and that they were aggressive. So this is a key part of how the Cold War mythology gets established. And I'll go ahead and elaborate this chronology here as to the main events that led to the Cold War. So you have George Kennan and his long telegram, which comes out in 1946. This is sort of famously described as setting the main ideological framework for containment. And the way that the Soviet Union gets depicted is, in very dire terms. In summary, he writes,
Aaron, I'm sorry to cut you off, but you should just really briefly mention who Kennan was. He was, of course, a major diplomat who had served in the Soviet Union and knew it from the inside.
Yeah, Kennan was a guy in the State Department, and his boss was Dean Acheson, and he was contemplating resigning from or quitting the Foreign Service before too long. When he wrote this, he writes this, it seems, partly to please Dean Acheson, his boss. So he has some insider knowledge about the Soviets, but there's an element of kind of careerism here also in his dire depictions of the Soviet Union, I think. So, and in part, he describes them, in a way here that I think is very useful for people who wanted a Cold War and who needed a Cold War for their sort of geopolitical strategy following the war. Kennan wrote, "In summary, we have here a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the U.S. there can be no permanent modus vivendi. The problem of how to cope with this force is undoubtedly the greatest task our diplomacy has ever faced, and probably the greatest it will ever have to face." It was written as a telegram, so it's like the wording is a little weird. But he's saying this is like this huge challenge to the U.S., and they believe that they cannot exist with the United States. This was just not true. The Russians and the Soviets wanted to exist with the United States. They would have liked to have had some of the aid that went to Western Europe to help rebuild their society, which they had lost as the America's supposed ally in that war, doing all the fighting. So
yeah, Aaron, speaking of aid after World War II, in terms of the Marshall Plan, there actually was money offered to the USSR, but it was less than what was offered to the defeated Nazi Germany. And at that point, I think it was more disrespect than anything else. And so the sense was, fine, we'll go rebuild on our own, rather than sort of accepting something so embarrassingly small compared to the people who just killed millions of from our country and destroyed 25 years of wealth and just sort of snuffed all that out from a huge amount of people. Just kind of made all of that disappear, all of this productive capacity. Some like 75% consumption drops by like about half. Like it's such a huge plummet in economic consumption. And Europe sees all this money pour in, some like $12 billion or something like that, which is, massive in today's money. And compare that to, they offer more to Nazi Germany than they do to the USSR, who then declines it, obviously.
Yeah, and people talk about how important Lend-Lease was, and it was important to help provide military materiel, weapons, tanks to defeat the Nazis, but that wasn't free money. That was aid, and the Soviet Union and then later post-Soviet Russian Federation were forced to pay back those billions and billions of dollars to the U.S. and didn't actually pay it back until the mid-2000s.
Yeah, and there were also strings attached to the Marshall Fund that were not going to be acceptable to the Soviet Union, and probably intentionally put in there to make sure that didn't happen. So that also ends up being the case with arms control and nuclear weapons control later. That it gets poisoned by the U.S., who puts in measures that they know will be unacceptable to the Soviet leadership, and so they're not able to cooperate. But then you can blame the Soviets and say, "Oh, look, they backed out." So shortly after Kennan issues the long telegram, which I think you have to see Dean Acheson's hand there as well. You have the Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946 from Winston Churchill, where he describes how this Iron Curtain has been laid across Europe, and this is kind of an aggressive, saber-rattling speech, right after the end of World War II. In March of 1947, you have Truman's Truman Doctrine speech, where he often says that the U.S. will support free peoples who are endangered around the world. And it doesn't really make much of a distinction between like vital and not so vital American security interests. So this is another escalation of the Cold War. It's really in large part about the Greeks and the civil war going on in Greece, and also, events in Italy that are coming down the pike. 1947, the U.S. Truman signs the National Security Act. This creates the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the National Security Council, and this is the real national security state structure of the U.S. empire is basically laid out at this time. CIA gets created at the behest of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, people like Allen Dulles of Sullivan and Cromwell, Ferdinand Eberstadt and James Forrestal of Dillon Reed, a Wall Street investment bank. And within this passage, within the National Security Act, there's the elastic clause that Clark Clifford put into it, which is very banal sounding, that the CIA would, quote, perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. So it just sort of obliquely says the CIA will do some other things that the National Security Council tells it to. Doesn't specify what that is, but of course
like
it means
coups, assassinations, rigging elections,
sexual blackmail,
other activities.
Yeah, exotic forms of assassination, and so on. I mean, everything under the sun, mind control programs, everything that you can think of. And so this is put in there in 1947. In 1948, you have NSC 10-2, which elaborates on covert operations. And I'll give you a little quote here from the document itself. Covert operations are so planned and executed that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to unauthorized persons, and that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. So already a year after the CIA has established, they're laying out the sort of legal, I mean, you can't even call it a legal justification. It's more of a declaration of just how it's going to be in these kind of national security documents. And because you've defined the Soviet Union as an existential threat bent on global domination with which there can be no peaceful modus vivendi, then you set the stage for being able to justify this kind of state power. And it's not, these documents were kept secret. It's not like the public was debating like, well, wait, what does it mean if we're going to have a secret service doing all these things and then lying about it? Isn't this going to be kind of anti-American, sort of more of a imperial monarchist kind of an institution, which it was. It was pretty much taking things that we would have been against philosophically for the British Empire and adapting them to the American case. And since it's kind of problematic, they just got around that by not talking about covert operations. So it's like it's very similar to the covert operations themselves. We're not going to be honest about what policies actually are, because we can use covert operations to make things happen and then say they didn't even happen. And we're not even going to be honest about the fact that we've assumed this power of using covert operations as a means to implement policy. So it's creating layers of secrecy and obfuscation and historical stupefaction of the American people. And it's profoundly anti-democratic, and it's established very early on in the Cold War. You have the Berlin airlift around this time as well, which gets depicted as Soviet aggression, when Soviets are taking actions that are reasonable, considering that they actually really fear a united Germany again, and they preferred for a sort of pastoralized, neutral Germany that would be broken up. But that wasn't what the U.S. takes steps to introduce a currency to get for all the other non-Soviet blocs. And Berlin is right there, and really what should be on the eastern side, but it's considered part of the West. So they have this big airlift. You have a war scare, which we'll talk about more in 1948, which is exaggerated for sort of nefarious purposes. And then in 1949, you have the communists winning in China and the Soviet development of the atomic bomb. And so all these events happen under Truman's, term. And these are the early stages of the Cold War. These are the sort of main events, and they're all depicted as communism aggressively on the march, and a force bent on overthrowing, everything that America holds sacred. They become the Manichaean devil that justifies whatever the U.S. empire wants to do.
And it isn't until as time goes on here, we have the early UN established, things like that, and there's sort of a ostensible loyalty to some principles of national sovereignty and anti-colonialism that the U.S. is using because they understand, and a lot of these same people are commissioning studies and looking at the way that it matters the way that the world sees us, and that they don't think that we are instituting an empire. So there's sort of an effort to recast the Soviets as imperialist, and the USSR is able to sort of act as a shield, at least at the UN, because they have veto power in the Security Council, things like that, that they step out of it until after the Korean War, when they realized like how costly giving away that sort of legitimacy back to the UN and by extension to the US is. And so they sort of rejoin the quote unquote international community, at least enough to try and involve themselves in third world movements enough to throw some sort of weight around behind them. But like you were saying, there is no threat of communist invasion of Europe. And to whatever extent that there is a communist threat, as it were, abroad, it's the fact that the communists were almost the only sort of partisan, like resistance forces during Nazi occupation of Europe and elsewhere. And so that has provided a lot of sort of like internal popularity. But coming out of that, the U.S. has to sort of recast the narrative while also internally making all of these plans to ratchet up the tension, because the more that there's sort of a perceived security threat domestically, the more we're able to project that out onto the global stage of actually this is just for our self-defense, when really like we are right on their borders and are very openly sort of goading them into war. And a lot of the time they stay out of even their quote unquote sphere of influence because they know that we're the only ones willing to use nukes, including in places like Iran, trying to get the Soviets to stop occupying there. So, there is no shortage of places that will go. And there are some less tasteful or less proper people who are involved with the U.S. deep state at this point. So what are some of the early components of the U.S. deep state that are being activated during this time?
Right. Well, you don't just have the national security complex that emerges in the wake of or with the passage of the National Security Act of 1947. You also have this netherworld kind of deep state milieu that emerges from the same forces that were behind the creation of the CIA, by and large. So in World War II, even while the fighting is still going on, you had Allen Dulles negotiating Operation Sunrise, the early surrender of the Nazis, which was just totally insubordinate, perhaps treasonous, and his efforts to recover, Axis gold, which he could use for nefarious purposes. They rehabilitate, quote unquote, some of these people after the war who were war criminals, and it's they're sort of incorporated into what Peter Dale Scott calls parafascism. He has a great essay on this from the late 70s, finally published in Lobster magazine in the 1980s. But really, these got some of the worst of the fascist, goons were taken and repurposed. Okay, the Axis itself, the Axis powers, were really the Anti-Comintern Pact, right? The Anti-Communist International Pact. And some of the fascists that they would employ, people like Otto Skorzeny, okay, that he gets picked up and sheltered by the CIA. Klaus Barbie gets rescued, taken off to South America, later emerges to participate in sort of clandestine chicanery with the CIA, and then later with like other even more deniable deep state entities. Karl Wolf, his story, he's an SS officer, war criminal. His story is well told in David Talbot's Devil's Chessboard, but Allen Dulles was intervening to try to save him. Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi intelligence chief, who later becomes the West German intelligence chief, a guy who should have been hanged as a war criminal, gets employed by the CIA and serves in the upper echelons of the West German state after the fact. Yoshio Kodama in Japan, Class A war criminal, gets sprung from prison, takes over $100 million in stolen war material to establish the Liberal Democratic Party, which is Japan's right-wing party, which still essentially runs Japan as a one-party state, basically up to the present day. Licio Gelli, probably pronounced that wrong, but the Italian fascist who was a liaison between fascist Italy and Hitler's Germany. And then in the Cold War, he's the venerable master of the Propaganda Due Masonic Lodge, which is more or less like a CIA cutout that combines mafia types, business elites, fascists, and so on, to act as a kind of secret deep state in Italy, more or less. But really, it's controlled by American forces. The relationship between the mafia and the American deep state goes back before the end of World War II. It's really the elites and their connections with the mafia. We've talked about this already, but organized crime has always been, the underworld has always been intertwined with the overworld of, capitalist elites. But in World War II, you have the OSS, which is the CIA precursor. They established Operation Underworld, where they take Meyer Lansky and they say, hey, can you help us to control the docks to protect against like sabotage or whatever, perhaps? And Lansky says, okay, you need to spring my friend Lucky Luciano from prison. And so these two guys who are running the syndicate, which is sort of a transnational or organized crime organization, they are brought in and given state sanction, and they're allowed to control the docks. This helps them to reestablish heroin connections later, which also involves some of these overworld and intelligence elements. So in Southeast Asia, for example, you have what eventually becomes Operation Paper, which helps to reestablish the Golden Triangle drug connection after the war. It involves the Kuomintang, which is the nationalist Chinese, the OSS people who were formerly OSS, the Flying Tigers, which was General Chennault's outfit there. They have an airline, and they get financing from the World Commerce Corporation, which had real bigwigs in the American elite, like Nelson Rockefeller, John McCloy, Richard Mellon were backers of it. And Paul Helliwell, the former OSS guy, CIA-connected lawyer down in Florida, close to Meyer Lansky, he was a part of organizing this. William Donovan, the head of the OSS and a Wall Street lawyer. William Stevenson, one of the top British intelligence guys, was involved in the World Commerce Corporation. And this whole episode of the World Commerce Corporation establishing these heroin connections after World War II in Southeast Asia, which of course later snowball into the Air America heroin scandal that Peter Dale Scott first exposed, I would say. Even though Al McCoy gets credit for it, I think he sort of came on after Peter. And this illustrates the way that like private power and organized crime and the intelligence agencies, even when they weren't intelligence agencies, they were like ex-spooks because the CIA didn't exist yet. They created they have this policy in Southeast Asia. And then once the CIA finally gets authorization to pick up the mantle, then these things get folded in. So, what's really the impetus for these alliances between the corporate elite and organized crime and the intelligence agencies? I think you have to trace it back to corporate power and corporate wealth that's interested in transnational profits and U.S. hegemony and the protection of capital around the world. That's where you really have to look for getting at who is in the driver's seat of American policy and who's really steering historical events at this time. There's the surface level of what happens in politics, but you can see the deep sort of clandestine world and the overworld and the political elites like Truman, and Acheson, these connections to the Wall Street elites, that these are all coming from like a similar force, even the parts that you don't see and the parts that you do see with this deep state system that's emerging in America at this time. And it really overrides democracy in America and leads to the kind of criminal, not so morally, strident or coherent enterprise that you have to have if you're going to have empire. Empire can't really be honest about itself if it's going to be democratic and liberal and adhere to professed American values. So you have it presented as not empire, and you have a secret kind of deep clandestine milieu that can also manipulate world events and use violence that it denies after the fact. And this gets established very early on, and it's appropriate that something like the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be kind of the violent birth of this whole American empire and the whole enterprise, the American century, as it were.
That's a great way of putting it. I mean, I have one final question. We could end there, but I just want to add a little coda to this. What we're talking about today is the early creation. There's still much more history, but the very beginning stages of the creation of the national security state and this institutional apparatus after the end of World War II. We talked about the Council on Foreign Relations. We talked about the National Security Act, which created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the NSA. In a previous episode, we talked about different theories of the state in the United States, and we talked about this book by this very mainstream professor, Michael Glennon. And his book is about the U.S. national security state, and he proposes this model of double government, he acknowledges essentially that there is a double government. In his case, he refers to one faction as the Madisonian institutions, and that would be, what in your model, the tripartite state, that would be, the public state. And he contrasts that, Glennon, this mainstream academic, he contrasts that against what he called the Trumanite network. And I just wanted to add a coda here before we conclude. I think it's important to kind of to understand. Clearly, you have a critique of Glennon's model. You add the other element of the tripartite state, of the deep state, the public state, and the national security state. But I'm wondering if we can just conclude here with thoughts of this idea of the Trumanite network, right? Because what we are talking about, it's true, these are institutions that for the most part emerged under Truman. And your book is chronological, and you go through each president. So I think in that sense, the Truman presidency is such an important historical moment in the history of the U.S. empire to understand how all these institutions were created. You mentioned that Truman was kind of this blank slate candidate, that he was put in through this coup to prevent Wallace, the left-wing VP, from being president. Can you just end briefly here, concluding on this thought of what a Trumanite is, right? Because we still hear that term today, Trumanite or Trumanism or whatever. Talk about this Trumanite network and its role in all of these institutions we're talking about today.
Yeah, I think that's important to focus on. And you want to get into the issue of why did Glennon decide to call the national security state the Trumanite network? And it's not, you can see why, because all of these institutions basically arise under the presidency of Harry Truman. But there was one general or observer to the whole decision to drop the atom bomb. And he described he said Harry Truman didn't so much spearhead that as he just got out of the way. And he went on to say, either he said this or somebody else did, that he was like a little boy on a toboggan. And so I think that's probably the good metaphor to describe Harry Truman through all of this. And it complicates the efforts of Glennon to try and say that these things should be called Trumanite, because it's like as though Truman is somehow emblematic of this. But Truman himself was picked not because he showed a lot of initiative or independence, but because he was pliable and he would take cues from the establishment. So people like Condoleezza Rice, for example, will say oh, Harry Truman was the best president, but he wasn't an exceptionally brilliant person or a really great orator or anything else. His defining characteristic is pretty much his co-optability and the ability to kind of appear sincere, even as he was quite co-opted and co-optable. So Truman is just, the Trumanites are not so much Trumanite. It's hard to know what would be a better term because of the way Glennon formulates it. But it's like, if you look at Truman, you see Truman is not really in the driver's seat. So why would a Trumanite network really be in the driver's seat? And it's not. It's just the national security state is more of a function of Wall Street and capitalism, just as Harry Truman owed his meteoric rise to the support of the American oligarchy. And so that's the shortcoming of Glennon's work. And yet you understand why he would leave that out, because the oligarchy is so significant in the U.S., and denial of the oligarchy is such a fixture of our mainstream ways of understanding and describing politics and history, that it's like it's too radioactive or scandalous to actually just point this out, because it's like, well, that's kind of like what Marxists say, and so we Marxists do not do well in U.S. academia by and large, and so let's just put it on Truman and Trumanites and the national security bureaucracy and not really look any further than that, which is better at least than saying in the U.S. is a democracy, but it still leaves a lot out.
Yeah, well, I think that's the perfect note to end on, because it really emphasizes how much of this is structural. And it's not so much about the individual sitting in the Oval Office. It's about these institutions that were created toward the end of World War II that we were talking about today. And we're going to continue this history going forward. I'm really looking forward to the next part of this, which is going to be about NSC 68 and the rise of the military-industrial complex. A lot of very interesting, exciting history here that is so important to understand our world today. But, we try to keep these episodes bite-sized, around an hour each. So we're going to take a break here, and we're going to come back in episode 13 and continue this history of the creation of the U.S. national security state. As always, I'm Ben Norton, a Multipolarista, and this show is co-produced with one of my favorite podcasts, the American Exception podcast, and my friends and co-hosts, Aaron Good and Seamus McGinnis. As always, this series is based on the book American Exception, Empire and the Deep State by Aaron. So definitely check out that book. It might be fun to read along while you listen. And of course, if you want to check out more of their episodes, go to patreon.com/American Exception. And you can support my work at patreon.com/Multipolarista. And we'll see you all next time. Thanks a lot.